Pirilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol didarı bana. Pirilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol didarı bana.
Selçuk Aydınlıoğlu, a Tirendaz member, has been working on developing a Selçuk bow. The Selçukian dynasty ruled Iraq, Iran, Anatolia and Syria in the 11th to 13th centuries, and it is somehow an underestimated sultanate, and it is quite an interesting era in the Turkish history as well, because it is a transition period in terms of the Islamization, in terms of the institutional base of that Turkish empire, which will also inspire the Ottoman court and the Ottoman culture in many aspects. This bow has been developed by using some depictions and very few written sources. The written sources are unclear. These kind of bows with ears is called Eastern Turkestan type bow by the famous researcher Ünsal Yücel, and these kind of bows have been widely used between 7th to 13th century in this geography, and we of course analyzed what kind of bow it could have been, because we really don't know that other than a few depictions like the illustration of Bedrettin Lulu in a 13th century book, Kitab-ül Agani.
Depictions on wall tiles as well as on ceramic plates.
And the miniatures in Gülşah and Varka. So this bow was supposed to be shorter than similar bows like the Hungarian bow, or at least shorter than the modern reconstructions of the Hungarian bow, because even the Hungarian bow might have been shorter than it is now.
The modern reconstruction of the Hungarian bow of the 10th, 11th centuries is based on the early research of Professor Gyula Fabian, who participated in the archaeological excavations of Magyar and Avar tombs in late 1970s. But although he was able to reconstruct a bow without having any intact remains, before he came to a conclusion how the bow really looked like, the practitioners came into the scene and started manufacturing the Hungarian bow, and this design has widely been accepted. The ancestors of modern Hungarians, the Magyars, came to the Carpathian Basin in late 10th century, and they brought this common culture from Inner Asia, where they immigrated from, including the weaponry and the horse culture and everything. And thanks to the archaeological findings, there are a lot of clues and evidence about their daily life, the tools they use and everything. But because the material that the bows had been made of are decomposing easily as natural materials, the real design of the bow is a mystery. But of course there was a common type of bow which was used in this era. The 11th century bow was probably not too much different than the 11th 13th century bows that had been used in a wider geography, including where the Selçukian lived.
Maybe a little bit more accurate in dating this type of bow. I said it was quite widespread between the 8th and the 14th centuries, but it doesn't mean that this bow did not appear before. In fact, the Russian archaeologists found out that this type of bow with unbendable rigid extremities at the limb tips existed in the era of Şirinus, 3rd century BC. So this type of bow might have been developed in this time and even earlier, but after 7th, 8th centuries, this bow spread wide up to the borders of Europe. So even the Blue Turks, which is the undisputable ancestral past of the Turkic race, used these kind of bows. And the end of the last Khaganate of Blue Turks is approximately 840, and the time that Selçuks appeared in the stage of history is just 160 years after that. So we would assume that the bow technology of Blue Turks may be related to the bows that Selçuks used just 150 years afterwards.
As we know from archaeological research, rigid bow tips which are supported with bone plates, as known as ears, emerged during the Shingle period. Bows with ear design have been one of the most important elements of Eurasian cultures for centuries. One of these is the Selçuk Turks, because some drawings or figures which show Selçuk archers suggest the possibility of using ear design in Selçuk bows. However, we don't have any ear plates because of the limited archaeological studies on this period. For this reason, sadly, studies on Selçuk archery mostly proceed through written or visual sources. The Selçuk Turks share same military tradition with August Turks and Turk Khaganate. Therefore, it is quite reasonable to use archaeological studies about them in order to understand Selçuk archery, because Soviet, Mongolian, Kazakh and Russian scientists and also other Turkic scientists have done a lot of research on archery of Turk Khaganate, and they also published them. One of the most important studies on this subject was written by Yuri Sergeyevich Hudyakov. He states that the archers of Turk Khaganate used 7 different bows. On the other hand, Vadim Vladimirovich Gorbunov considered only ear plates of Altai region, and then he stated that the archers of Turk Khaganate used 5 different bow types. According to him, 3 of 5 of the bow designs are original, which were emerged in the Turkic Khaganate period. And 2 of them are related with older bow making tradition of Inner Asia. When we look to the other 2 unique designs, Gorbunov stated that no bone plates were used in the ears of these bows, but the plates on the handle were still used. In these designs, the length of the bow limbs has been shortened, and the length of the bow has been reduced in general. According to Hudyakov, the lengths of the bows used in Turk Khaganate were between 115 centimeters and 145 centimeters.
If it comes to have an idea about how the bows of the 8th century looked like, I have a very good solid example in my hands, a replica of the so-named Zargalan or Jargalan bow, made by the famous bowyer and one of my mentors, Adam Karpovich. He was so kind that he has always supported our attempts to revive the Turkish traditional archery, and very recently he also sent this bow that he had made for me to check and to test. So this is, as I said, Jargalan or Zargalan bow, named after the area it was found in, the Mongolian steppes, where the Gökturks or Blue Turks have lived. So this is quite a very good example. And as you see, this is a bow with ears and with relatively shorter limbs. and of course a reflex bow covered with birch bark or toz, as it was called by Ottomans. This bow is 138 centimeters from nock to nock, but the overall length is a little bit over 140 centimeters, because there are 4 centimeter additional length just after the nock to the very tip of the bow. It is important because the archers usually measure the bows from nock to nock because they are interested in the working part of the bow. However, the archaeologists may give the data of the total length of the bow. So it is also important to know whether the measurements given by the archaeologists is the total length between the nocks or between the very tip of the bow. Anyway, this is an approximately 140 something bow, and it also matches the data that the Russian historians and archaeologists gave, as quoted by Recep Efe Çoban. He said that the Blue Turk bows were measured from 115 to 145 centimeters. So this can be considered as the longest found in the Blue Turk graves or tombs, and this is quite a short bow, easy to handle, and as we guessed, or as we predicted, the working limb to the ear section, the ratio between them is so adjusted that the working limb is under bigger pressure or strain. So it was supposed to be a faster bow compared with a bow that had a longer working limb and a shorter ear.
I owe great thanks to Adam Karpovich, and I will always be grateful to him because of what he did and what he is still doing. And having such a bow in my hand, which is a representative of the early Turkic bow and made by a very skillful, very knowledgeable and very famous bowyer, is really something. And as promised to Adam, our next project will be testing this bow, and not only for harvesting the technical data, which had already been done by Adam, but also with some other experimental models with which we would have insights about how the bow really was used on the battlefields in the past.
We found out that the relative length of the kulak section or ear section should be a little bit longer, so it had a shorter salva section or working limb.
Another important matter is the arrow length. Again, in the studies of Gorbanov, 4 different quivers, i.e. arrow bags, of Turkic Kaghanat were discussed. The lengths of these quivers are between 82 and 96 centimeters. But I want to say that it should not be forgotten that the 82 centimeter long quiver belongs to a child who is about 137 centimeters.
Quivers and arrows found in the archaeological excavations are very important in order to understand how far these bows have been drawn, although the arrow length alone is not a very good indicator, because first of all, we really don't know whether the arrows have been drawn to their full length or not. And of course, it may also depend on the height and body structure of the archer. And of course, a good archaeological assessment would give an idea about that. For example, the Hungarian archaeologists listed the quivers together with the corpses found next to these quivers. So This is also a very good data to be able to understand how the bows were drawn, or how long, how far the bows were drawn.
Gorbunov thinks that the arrow length in the Altay region may have changed in the range of 80 and 85 centimeters. When all the information is considered together, actually, it seems that the length of the bows with the ear design has decreased over the time, but long arrows were used with these bows.
A long arrow may not always indicate a longer draw, because the bow associated to these arrows may be short, and even a composite bow can withstand a certain strain. So the composite bows can also be drawn to a certain degree or certain draw length. But if the arrow length is quite high, if the arrows are longer than usual, it would indicate a heavier arrow, if not a longer draw.
There's very interesting theory by Gorbunov and Rudyakov. They stated the possibility of shortening the bows in order to make faster and more accurate shots at shorter ranges, shorter distance.
In our group, in Tirendaz, we are trying to revive all the aspects of Turkish archery. Not only the Ottoman archery, which is maybe the most famous one because of the renowned flight shooting records, but the Selçuk era is quite a brilliant era in the Turkish history, and it's worth to revive with the archery culture as well.
Interestingly, Selçuk archaeology was not of great interest, at least not by the archaeology departments of the universities in Turkey. They have been focusing mainly on the proto-history and history of Anatolia, like Urartu, Hittite, and the great culture. But in the last few decades, Selçuk archaeology somehow started, and the settlements have been excavated mainly by the art history departments. And one of the art historians who has been working on this subject is Dr. Alptekin Yavaş, who successfully excavated some arrowheads from Selçuk era and also wrote a brilliant book about that.
It's worth to make a composite bow that requires a lot of time and labor to complete. It should be short. If you build or make a composite bow too thick or too wide, so if it is overbuilt, the energy transfer is diminished. So you really don't need to have a composite bow, because a well-made set bow would do the job. So a composite bow is worth almost always if it is made short. That's why we came out to be a shorter limb design. There are exceptions, of course. The Manchu bow, for example, is quite long, and like many other Chinese bows, but the dynamics are completely different on that bows.
Manchu bow is one of the latest representative of this type of bow, bows with ears. And Peter Decker, my Dutch friend, is specialized on Manchu archery. For further information, you can visit his website, manchuarchery.org. And he's also the moderator of the famous ATARN, Asian Traditional Archery Research Network, where you can get more information about this very interesting, valuable, and unique part of the Asian archery tradition.
And as I told before, we have some evidence, although it is not very solid from the depictions, that the Seljukian bow was shorter.
The ballistic features of any bow are given by its physical characteristics, how long the bow is, whether it has ears or not, what's the total mass, what's the angle between the ears and the saw, whether the bow has side plates or not. But it is not enough to understand the real design of the bow, to understand the field performance of it, because there should be an optimization in the use of the bow in terms of the draw length it is drawn to, the arrow weight it has the maximum performance with. So in order to understand the real field performance, some experimental research is necessary. As we showed in our previous video, drawing the bow just for an inch longer provided a remarkable increase in the energy efficiencies. So there should have been an optimization which made the bow a reliable and efficient weapon under the circumstances that it was used. The bow design and the material may allow the archer to draw farther, and depending on the design of the bow, a longer draw may have or may provide more energy efficiency. This bow that we've been working on seems to be one of those bows of which energy transfer is dependent on the draw length, as we showed that drawing the bow just 1 inch longer enhanced the energy transfer remarkably for almost 5%.
We tested this bow actually with 10 GPP arrow first from 28-inch draw length, and now today we will try to see whether it will make a contribution to the energy efficiency if we draw it to 29 inches with higher GPP arrows. For instance, this one is for 14 GPP, and this one with white fletching, it's 13 GPP. We will see what this bow will do with higher GPP arrows today.
Birilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol didarı bana. Birilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol didarı bana. Ya 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 Allah bir Muhammed Ali, nazar eyle bari bana. Ezü celalin aşkına, çektirme şol zari bana. Birilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol.
Selçukian bow tested with a 14 GPP of arrow at 29 inches of draw. The bow pulls 53 pounds at 29 inches, and the arrow weighs 14 GPP at the draw weight that the bow gives at 29 inches. Evet. 153. Evet. 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 1.5. In this second video of the testing of Selçukian bow made by Selçuk Aydınlıoğlu, we tried to figure out whether the bow would reach higher energy efficiency levels with longer draws or with heavier arrows, because we assumed that the warfare in pre-Ottoman time could have been from a very close distance thanks to the mounted warfare. So we today tested the bow with quite heavy arrows for 14 and 15 GPP. So and as we assumed, the results revealed that our theory may be quite accurate, because although the bow was below the Ottoman type bows in energy efficiencies, when the arrows are relatively lighter, 8 GPP, 9 GPP, and 10 GPP, it was around 60% of energy efficiency. But now, even if we shot the bow from 28 inches of draw, a 14 GPP arrow gave a 64.3%, and the 15 GPP arrow gave a 67.9, which is 68% of energy efficiency. But if you go for a longer draw, for a 9 inches of draw, the 13 GPP arrow gave a 70.5% energy efficiency, and a 14 GPP arrow gave it 72.2% energy efficiency, which is identical to that of an Ottoman bow. So, which means if you draw a pre-Ottoman early Turkic bow to 29 inches and use a heavy arrow, then you can reach the same energy levels, which means that the arrow is loaded with a lot of kinetic energy, which would be quite efficient on the target it hit. So this also matches the reality that the warfare was from a closer distance. And as Recep Efe Çoban also stated, that the changes of the morphology of both bow and arrows in the Turk Kaghanate era showed that the arrows were long and probably drawn longer, despite the fact that they might have not been drawn to their full length, but they have been drawn longer. And of course, a longer arrow may indicate that they were heavier. Anyway, so the quite long quiver length in the Göktürk era, in the Blue Turk era, that reaches 95 centimeters, proves that that was the way that the early Turkic bows were used.
Our findings clearly showed that this type of bows are more energy efficient with longer draws and heavier arrows. Of course, we can never know whether these bows were really drawn longer, at least unless we can find a perfectly intact example which we replicate and see how far it can be drawn. But the mathematics does not lie, so such a bow with such a design shoots with more energy transfer with heavier arrows and longer draws. So the archaeological data also confirms to some extent that the arrows were at least heavier because of their length, and they could have been also drawn longer. So we may assume that the combat distance was relatively shorter with heavier arrows, and it is possible technically because they all were mounted and they could adjust the distance between the enemy and themselves by using their mount. But still, a very heavy arrow would be a problem because of the lack of a flat trajectory. So how did they handle this problem? Okay, they had a heavy arrow that carried quite a big amount of kinetic energy and would be very efficient in the combat. But if it comes to accuracy, a more or less flat trajectory would be necessary, and how they handled that. So to answer this question, we have things to plan and we have some experimental models that we are working on. So please stay tuned.
Birilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol didarı bana. Birilere niyaz ederiz, yalan dünya ni deriz. Ölürüz hasret gideriz, göster şol didarı bana. Ya